After Pro Skater 4 was released, Neversoft was pretty familiar with the 6th generation of video game consoles and their power. So, in order to demonstrate this power and give gamers a brand new skating experience, they decided to take the Tony Hawk series in a new direction with the Underground games and American Wasteland. The games now had stories, even more complex levels, big additions to the base gameplay, and the ability to do more than just skate. While most of these new additions were welcome changes, some weren't fitting or were all that great. So in today's video, I'll be discussing what made these games what they are, and if these changes to the Tony Hawk formula were what the series needed. First of all, let's talk about the biggest addition to these games, and that is how the campaign mode was changed into a story mode. Of course, the players are still going around doing all kinds of goals and challenges, but this time, they'll be playing as their custom-made character for most of these story experiences, and their character is given a personality, dialogue, and more motives than just becoming the best skater. The first Underground and American Wasteland were more about hitting the big time with skating, but also realizing what skating is all about, while the second Underground is more focused on doing the most outrageous stuff possible around the world, as a fun trip with the boys. It's very Jackass-like, thanks to how prominent Bam Margera is in that story. Before I go into the gameplay of the career mode, I want to talk about the stories themselves. Now, while I think the stories are all special in their own way, Underground 1 certainly had the best story. It felt grounded and fairly realistic, like something that could have happened in real life. It felt like a very appropriate story to tell for the Tony Hawk games. As much as I do like the humor in Underground 2 and the crew in American Wasteland, Underground 2 felt a little too zany for this series, and the latter just doesn't have the same goodness of the first Underground. Again, Underground 2 was very much inspired by Jackass, so its mood is so much different than that of its predecessors, so its story mode feels kinda out of place. That's not to say the Tony Hawk games never had edgy humor, it just wasn't as over the top and extreme as Underground 2's story was. American Wasteland's story is fine too, but again, there are some things in there that are kind of too zany for the series. However, the characters are quite likable, and the plot is gripping, so it's just fine. I feel if they cut out some of the wacky stuff from the story like Master Zen and the Black Widows, the story would have felt more down to earth, and in line with how a Tony Hawk story should feel. Well, with the stories out of the way, let's discuss the gameplay of the career modes. The campaign gameplay for Underground 1 and 2 are pretty fun for the most part. The first Thug felt like a mixture between the classic mode of the first 3 games and the career of Pro Skater 4, in that there's old school goals like getting certain high scores, mixed in with goals that play with the new physics and controls, and this formula worked well with the flow between the gameplay and cutscenes. It also meant that career mode didn't stray too far from the fundamentals that made this series great. The only thing I really didn't like all that much about the first Underground's career gameplay is I wish there was a bit more variety amongst the missions. It can feel at times that the player has already done a similar or identical goal multiple times before, so this makes the gameplay boring sometimes. Secondly, the vehicle missions don't fit in at all with the Underground formula. The Underground games had very fluid skating physics, so doing combos in these games feels so good and natural because of how much control the player has over their skater. So to have missions that revoke a lot of this control really kills the vibes and doesn't fit it all that well. Moving on to the second game, Underground 2 was real fun with the amount of chaos the player could do in the career mode. I mean, blowing up Skatopia, then having to escape it was insane, not to mention some of the other crazy missions in the story mode. I also really enjoy how smooth the missions can be accomplished in this game. In Underground 1 and American Wasteland, players have to talk to someone in order to initiate a mission, but in this game, as long as the player knows what they're doing, they can start most goals without having to stop their flow. Speaking of which, I also like how there's a lot of goals that have players using the higher elevations of the levels in order to beat them. There's just something so fun about Underground 2's flow and getting high up that works so well together. Anyways, each story level in Underground 2 has 4 different paths. One for the custom skater, one for the chosen pro skater, a guest character, and a special character. It's not a bad system, it has more goals, which is great, but not every path feels unique enough to differentiate itself from the rest. Like, the guest character in each level has a different vehicle they use, and while they loosely follow the physics of skating, they all also have their own feel, with this feel playing into the goals of said character. Most of these vehicles work just fine too. Steve-O's bull is really the only one that controls so slippery and weird. Anyways, this path is really the only one in my opinion that has enough room to separate the rest of the characters and their goals. The rest of the paths feel like they have the same kind of goals, they just have to be done with different characters. Getting on to our last entry, American Wasteland isn't as crazy as its predecessors, but not as grounded as the first game either, and I think that's part of the reason its career mode wasn't as good as its predecessors. I do like the gameplay of American Wasteland's career mode, but it didn't really do anything that different from its predecessors that made it that unique and special. Like, there's the ability to get more pieces of graffiti art via the tagger character, the players can get tattoos, and they can get money through various means. But to me, none of these things are standout innovations that make this game better than its predecessors. There's also BMX goals too, which I never understood why these were implemented into the game, but if the player wants to beat the game, they don't have to do them, so they're not really anything to talk about. On to my complaints about this career mode. One of the things that sucked about American Wasteland was limiting the player's moves and locking them behind tutorial missions. Underground 1 had tutorial missions too, but they could be done a lot quicker than American Wasteland's tutorials. The first hour or so of the third entry is so boring for expert because of how slow it is in teaching returning players stuff they already know. Not to mention, there are already missions intertwined with the tutorial missions in THAW to break some of the monotony. Underground 2 did it best. The game gave players plenty of room to learn the basics and some of the new mechanics of the game in the training level, but if the players were fine without them, they could completely skip the lessons and go about their way. Nudge, but don't force players. Also, players can't freely upgrade their stats in American Wasteland like they can in the previous two games. They have to wait until the skate shop swaps the challenges, so that kinda also adds on to why the limits of this game suck. While still complaining about this game, I also dislike having to get money to buy certain things, or having to do graffiti in order to get into the Black Widows. They just don't fit in with the formula set up by its predecessors. They're boring, and kinda kill the vibe of just going through every mission. Alright, with the stories all out of the way, let's get on to some of the other big changes to the Tony Hawk formula. First of all, the players can now get off their board and walk around without having their feet glued to four-wheel contraptions. Now, this was just an outstanding feature. Having players constantly on their skateboards in the previous games could really feel awkward sometimes, like the many times I had to slowly turn around on my board and slowly approach an objective in the Pro Skater games just to get it done. In these games, however, I can walk straight to an objective without having to fight the piece of wood under my skater's feet, and it just feels so good. Not to mention, getting off the board during the combo allows for the combo to continue, so players can incorporate walking into their lines. So yeah, such a simple feature makes the gameplay so much smoother and fluid. Getting off the board allows for more than just walking around though. Players can also climb buildings and get to certain areas by shimmying around, and while the climbing is far from perfect, it feels fine, and it allows for easier access to secret spots, especially places that are high up. American Wasteland even added in some parkour for the off-board gameplay, and it works quite well because of how much easier it is to get to higher elevation with some of these tricks. Underground 2 introduced Focus Mode, which lets the player slow down time after they filled up their special meter. This addition is fine, but as an expert, I hardly ever used it, and there's only a few missions that require it, so I don't have much to say about it. Speaking of another feature that's neat, but I never really used, the player can also create a trick in all three games, and create their own graffiti in THAW 2 and American Wasteland. Considering how important tricks are to the gameplay, allowing players to create their own tricks that play into their custom character style is neat, and the same goes for creating their own tags. So while I never really used these features, they were nice ways for players to customize their skaters and spice up the gameplay. Apart from the story and new gameplay mechanics, Underground 2 and American Wasteland also have a classic mode, which is close to the gameplay of the first three games. Complete a couple of goals in different maps in order to advance to the next level. I really enjoyed this feature. Something about that classic gameplay from the Pro Skater games is so fun, and doing them with the fluid gameplay of these games just feels so right. The classic modes also provided unlockables whenever they were beaten, such as new maps and new characters. So whenever players were done with having some old school fun, they got rewarded with incentives that were so worth it. I like Underground 2's classic mode more than I like American Wasteland's. It just boils down to the fact it had more levels, and players were given a choice as to which level they wanted to do next. I will say, the quote-unquote new maps for American Wasteland were quite fun though. They work quite well with the classic mode, so even if it is a lot shorter, it's still pretty fun and engaging. Each of these games also have multiple difficulties for their campaign and classic modes, and each requires a different amount of effort and gives different rewards. Now, for the most part, I do like this addition. Letting players choose how hard they want to get hit is great for new fans that are still learning the basics and how to lay down some sick combos, and it's great for veterans that know how to work their skater and use every aspect of the game. The problem I have with it is how the unlockables work alongside it. As I mentioned, each difficulty gives its own rewards when beat, but these unlockables don't stack. So, in other words, players won't get the rewards that are obtained when the game is beaten on easy if they beat the game on hard. It's annoying for experts to go back and play the same goals again, without really being challenged on easy mode, despite the fact they beat the game on hard mode. They've already proven themselves, so why should they prove themselves again? The second issue I have with the system is the rewards don't get better as the difficulty gets harder. Like, if the player couldn't care less about the special characters they would obtain from beating the game on hard, there's little incentive for them to do so. It'd be nice if beating the game on hard gave the player really cool cheats, new maps, or new stuff for them to put on their custom character besides new skaters. Don't get me wrong, I love the secret characters as much as the next guy, but it's not like some of them are really worth it. Speaking of the special characters, the Underground games had a ton of them. There's so much more hidden characters in these games especially Underground 2, that can be unlocked whether it be through beating certain modes or finding every gap. Neversoft went crazy in putting so many different characters in the game. It was kind of ridiculous, but also great too. One of the reasons why there's so many characters is every NPC is playable, and these games had a lot of unique pedestrians in each level. The pedestrians all have their own attire that fit in with the area they're in. I love having the pedestrians as playable characters in Underground 2, mostly because I like playing as the aliens, so I gotta give Neversoft some credit for this simple but awesome addition. While still on this topic, one of the things I really disliked about American Wasteland was the lack of really cool and odd special characters. Underground 1 and 2 had characters like Iron Man, Thud, Shrek, and the Hand, and they were small but very enjoyable rewards the player would earn after beating the story or classic modes. But American Wasteland doesn't have unlockable characters that add to this world. You got a few real life musicians, and some of the characters from the story mode, really nothing of note. I really enjoyed skating about as the secret characters and the pro skaters in the Underground games, so it was a real big letdown for this entry to remove them. Another thing I disliked about these games was the focus on having to find every gap. Now I know Pro Skater 1 and 4 had a reward for players that found every gap in their levels, but they weren't that big of rewards. They were just secret characters that you could really live without. These games, on the other hand, lock the cheats behind having to find every gap, and let me tell you, finding every gap is boring as hell, even when you have a guide helping you along the way. I really wish unlocking cheats in these games was more like Pro Skater 2 and 3, where you beat the career mode and you get some cheats. They felt like a fair trade-off. Having to find every gap just to get some cheats is so repetitive and monotonous. Getting these cheats really isn't worth it. The levels for all three of these games are really well done with the amount of complexity they have, the way all the pieces come together, and the flow of skating in them. Like Pro Skater 3 and 4, there's always a way to get higher, and players can get on top of just about every building in sight. The levels in Underground 2 and American Wasteland are very interactive too, in that significant parts of the layout can be changed. Sure, all the games beforehand had this feature, but Underground 2 let players change the whole vibe of certain levels like New Orleans. Underground 2 even had a level that was pretty much 3 different levels put together, and players unlocked the next area by doing a certain feat in the other parts of the level. I thought this idea was really creative. I always thought it was neat to have 3 completely different areas in one level, and not only is every section fun to play in, but they also have a good amount of depth too, so that was real nice. Speaking of depth to levels, Underground 2 and American Wasteland also have day and night cycles, and it's neat to see how the game will turn on artificial lights as the sun goes down and the stars fill the sky. American Wasteland reused some of the levels from the PSP version of Underground 2, and also has the oil rig from the Xbox version of Pro Skater 3, but they did add goals players could do in these areas. So, while I kind of wish they just made more new levels, these maps are fine, and quite fun, especially considering how well they work with American Wasteland's physics. To highlight some of the maps from these games, I'm going to list my favorite level from each of them, and tell you why I think they work so great. My favorite level from Underground 1 is probably Vancouver. The layout is real nice. All the different terrains work together, and getting up to the high levels in the hotel is fun, and allows for some sick acid drops. My favorite level from Underground 2 is a tough choice, but I'd probably say the Triangle. While this map lacks some verticality, I just really like its idea more than anything. It's quite unique, and having all the different pieces allows for players to come up with various ways to skate about and score points. All the crazy stuff happening in the background is also a nice touch, and works with the serious humor. My favorite level from American Wasteland has to be the ranch after every piece has been attained. The collage of all kinds of different stuff in the area is just so fun to skate on. Every piece has its own personality, and since these things come from various locations, there's pieces dedicated to the many different moves players can pull off in these games. While still on this entry and levels, American Wasteland advertised no loading screens, but what it really meant was no static loading screens. And sure, they work for the console ports just fine, but if you're playing this game on a modern PC, it's kinda painstaking. You see how fast this game loads on today's hardware? Yeah, it's kind of a drag having to deal with these little sections when I know my rig could load everything in without even flinching. At the very least, I guess I can still bust out combos while I wait. Well, since each of these games has a story mode, they naturally have cutscenes, and they're fine for the most part. They all fit in with the vibes of their respective games, and they're all adequate in telling the unfolding narrative. Underground 2 and American Wasteland even had cutscenes that showcase whether a change in the environment unfolded. The facial expressions and body language from the characters are quite good too. It actually feels like the characters are just being themselves, rather than a game engine forcing them to follow lines of code. Well, actually, Underground 1 has some cutscenes where the facial movements could be better, because there are times when a skater's face is kinda static, and it looks like they aren't all there. Alright, before I end the visual section, I want to bring on the menus and UI. Underground 2 and American Wasteland's UI were just fine. They're fast, simple, and tell the player all the information they need, while still fitting in with the vibes of the game they're a part of. Same applies to Underground 1, but this game has different themes for the venues in this game, and they're really cool. We're not just talking about slightly different colors for the text or text boxes. Each of the themes really have their own personality and are quite appealing to look at. Not only are themes centered around skating, you know, the main component of this game, but even the secret characters have their own UIs, which I thought was neat. It made playing as a secret character is immersive in a way. Let's talk about the music for these games. The soundtracks after Pro Skater 4 got pretty varied. Underground 1 introduced some heavy metal to the series with bands like Superjoint Ritual, and while I can't say they're the best edition, I also can't say that they're the worst edition either. Their adrenaline works with the fast action of the games, but they're a little too heavy to perfectly fit in. Underground 2 introduced some classic music with Frank Sinatra, brought back old school rock with the Doors and the Ramones, and more metal with Lamb of God, Ministry, and 3 Inches of Blood. To me, some of these picks were very odd. It's not like they're bad songs or anything, but man, they just don't fit in with the skating of these games. I understand why the Underground games introduced some slower and longer songs to the soundtracks. Since players can get off their boards, they can relax a little and explore the area without having to stress about getting stuff done. The previous entries were very much focused on speed and getting things done quickly, especially considering how the first 3 games had a timer during career runs. So it made sense where their soundtracks were short punk songs and other types of adrenaline pumping music. Since players really aren't on a time limit in the career mode of these games, they can take as much time as they want with the challenges. So, as such, longer songs can be heard the entire way through, hence their inclusion. American Wasteland's soundtrack was just right. It got rid of some of the odd music choices from its predecessors, and it has a lot of punk and hip-hop songs that really fit with the Tony Hawk series. There are some other genres thrown in there too, but I feel those songs aren't far off from the vibes of the series. American Wasteland has some exclusive songs too. There's a couple of covers of old punk songs by famous rock bands, including, but not limited to, My Chemical Romance, Rise Against, and Fall Out Boy, just to name a few. I really like the addition of these songs. Not only do I think they're good covers, but they fit in with American Wasteland's vibes. Not to mention, I think these songs are kind of reflective of the classic mode, due to how they take an old thing and revamp it in a way that's new and works for what it was made for. The cutscenes in these games also use small samples of the songs from its soundtracks, and they work well with the situation happening on screen, and it just makes so much sense to incorporate the soundtrack into the cutscenes. I mean, the skating FMVs have always had songs that were already in the game in the background, so why not do the same for the cutscenes? Before I move on from the music, I just want to bring up that certain zones in Underground 2 and American Wasteland have their own music that fits in with the scenery of said area. It's kind of a cool addition. It adds on to the immersion, but it really doesn't do much for me, especially when I have a collection of awesome music at my disposal anyways. Luckily, players can turn these off if they don't care about them, so I suppose that's just fine. Well, enough about the music, let's get on to the voice acting. With full-fledged stories, these games saw a lot more voice acting than any of the previous games, but in any case, the voiceover work for these games are good. In Pro Skater 4, each pro skater featured in these games voice themselves, and they do a fine job of making it seem like they're talking to the player or another NPC, rather than just reading a sheet of paper in front of them. The characters that don't have a pro skater attached to them also have convincing lines too, and their voice actor fits in with the personality and looks of said character. Well, that's all I had to say about these games. Underground 1 really changed things up for the Tony Hawk formula, and while its successors did take a few steps back regarding this formula, they also took a lot of steps in the right direction, if you ask me. Sure, Underground 2's story felt kind of out of place for skateboarding, but it's funny, the career mode is fun, and has such a nice flow, and the introduction of the classic mode was great. American Wasteland's story wasn't as good as Underground 1's, it reuses a couple of older levels, and has some annoying things in its career mode, but there's still a lot of fun to be had with collecting branch pieces, its off-board movement feels great, and the soundtrack was so good because it felt so in line with the series, and it even had new songs made for it, which I always thought was neat. All these games are special in their own ways, so it's really hard for me to say which one is the best. They all hold a special place in my heart, considering how much I loved them, and how much I played them growing up. Okay, before I end this video, I just want to mention THAW, which is this really cool mod for American Wasteland. It optimizes the game in a way to work with modern PCs, like having easy resolution setters, the ability to run the game at 120 frames, a working online service, adds a bunch of characters and levels from the other Tony Hawk games, among other Neversoft games, revamped skating physics, the ability for custom soundtracks, mod support, and a lot of customization options. I recommend it for anybody that wants to play that game. With all that being said, thanks for watching and have a good day.